Hi, everybody. I'm Sarah Emond. I'm ICER's president and CEO. For those who are just joining this part of the meeting, this is what we call our policy roundtable. This is an opportunity for us to reflect on the votes today, the discussion we've had, dive into some of the issues that we started to surface as part of the conversation and the deliberation, but also really focus on what do we do now? If we have this level of evidence, if we have these prices, if we have these drugs, what are we doing to ensure that the policies around price and access for patients are rooted in the evidence that we have? What are the nuances that we need to consider when we're thinking about the patient access piece, the patient affordability piece? How are we ensuring that affordability for not just patients with IgAN, but for patients generally is front and center? We're so grateful that two of the manufacturers have joined us today for the policy roundtable. We'll do introductions in just a minute, but I really do also want to give another special thank you to Vera for participating in our economic model pilot earlier. That was great to hear your specific suggestions and perspectives on the economic model. I think it really elevated the level of conversation and the voting that we had today. A few of the themes that we're going to get to that are going to kind of overarch a lot of what we're talking about, and it goes back to some of what I mentioned at the very beginning. We have an affordability problem in our healthcare system right now. Health insurance premiums are rising at such a rate that people are being harmed. And so we think at ICER about how we are collectively responsible for ensuring affordable access for not just patients with IgAN, but for all patients. And so that's going to be what I'm inviting everyone who's participating in the roundtable today to hold with them as they think about their own perspectives, their own desires, hopes, what they want to see out of this treatment landscape. The other thing I want to make sure we don't lose sight of, and so I'm going to just say it right from the beginning, we'd mentioned it a few times today. There's some amazing innovation in this field for this condition. This is exactly the type of innovation that we want out of a robust biopharmaceutical ecosystem. And so, yay. And that is a wonderful thing to have in front of us. And there's a part of me that says, how lucky are we that we get to have a conversation about how we're going to afford it and how we're going to pay for it, because we've got data here that are showing meaningful improvements for patients for a condition that did not have anything just a couple of years ago. And so we're going to hold that with us as we talk about things today. All right, next slide. Let's let everybody who's with us today for the roundtable introduce themselves. You've heard from some of them already today, but again, for those just joining us, John, why don't you say hi?
Yeah, hi everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. Fascinating process. I'm an adult nephrologist from the UK with a career-long interest in glomerular disease and particularly IgA nephropathy.
Thank you, John. Leslie.
Hi, I'm Leslie Fish from IPD Analytics. We're a data analysis company. And I'm here actually to talk about, since we have most insurers, hospitals, et cetera, in the United States as our subscribers, that part of it, of healthcare. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you, Leslie. Lobat.
Hi, I'm Lobat Hashemi. I'm a global head of health economics and outcomes research here at Veloxis/Calliditas Therapeutics.
Fantastic. Thank you for being here, Lobat. Jay.
Hi, everyone. Jay Jackson. I lead our health economics and outcomes research at Vera Therapeutics.
Thank you, Jay. Tony.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tony Pisa. I'm a patient advocate and supporter, hopefully to share the voice of patients. I'm also living with IgAN and a successful kidney transplant patient of 4 years and super grateful every day because of it.
Thank you so much, Tony. Sam.
I'm Samantha Schweisthal. I do go by Sam. I am an individual living with IgAN and the Alabama ambassador for the IgA Nephropathy Foundation. And for work, I'm a graduate research assistant at Auburn University.
Thank you, Sam. And Shika.
Hi, everyone. Thanks again for having me. Shika Wadwani. I'm an adult nephrologist based here in South Texas and specialize in glomerular diseases. Thrilled to be part of this. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, we can take down the slides so we can see each other. We're going to be together for the next little under hour and a half as we try to unpack some of these issues. We typically start by trying to address any issues around health equity that might exist for the condition, for access to treatments, and we're going to get there. But after listening to the conversation today, there's two things that I want to handle first. And one of them is steroids. So get ready, John and Shika. We're just going to talk about it. We're going to lay it out there. We're going to just all the things, all the feelings, since that came up so much today. But first, I'm going to put Sam and Tony on the spot. Sam and Tony, if you guys had something that you'd want us to keep with us today during the policy roundtable about what it's been like to live with it, your diagnostic journey, how excited you are that there's new therapies. If there was something that was said today, and you don't have to name names, but if there was something that was said today, you're like, oh, I really wish they had this other perspective in their head. I want everyone in the conversation today to be grounded in how you are thinking about this moment for treatment for patients with IgAN. So Sam, can I start with you? What do you want us to have in our heads as we get started today?
It's a little bit difficult, and I don't want to seem like I'm dismissing anybody's standpoint or anything, but just like truly the nuance and humanity that needs to be there when considering patients. I know for myself, being a young woman, um, one of my doctor's like greater concerns and still is me like wanting and like asking me if I want to have children one day, and I've already come to the decision that I don't. And I feel like her and honestly most of my medical team puts that on me, and I don't need my treatment to surround that. I need my treatment to be centered on me, and I wish that they did that for me more of the time. And that goes with like anything that I have going on.
Sam, I really appreciate that. Thank you. We're going to carry that with us. I think what I hear from that is also when the patient tells you something, believe them. And I think that that's a really important thing for us all to have in mind as we talk today. Tony, how about you? Something you want us to have in mind as we talk about some of these very nerdy and very wonky issues that we've been talking about today?
Well, I appreciate what Samantha just shared. Humanizing, I think, is very important. And I think everybody on this call is here because they care. If not, people wouldn't spend the time doing it. It's a very heady project. The prospect of, I look back when I was diagnosed, and I know these problems for me started much earlier, probably similar to where Sam's age is now, but, not knowing looking back 2020, but then just seeing small changes in your body's behavior or certain things and not being diagnosed by your primary care physician, or even, having the ability to talk to a nephrologist, in your late 20s or early 30s, because it didn't seem like you were spilling much protein. The trend wasn't really there. Looking back, you could see some of that trend, but I think that's why it goes so undiagnosed, right? There's still a lot to learn and a lot to share. And I'm very much an advocate to try and learn and find out as early of an age as possible. And so I think that's one thing to kind of leave here is early diagnosis, I think is important. When I was diagnosed, and it didn't seem like that long ago, December of 2019, there were zero options other than steroids.
Right.
And that's, the worst thing that you could possibly hear, right? Great, you have one of these four things. Great, you biopsy. You now have this thing. And guess what? There's no options other than this. And as logical as you can be, as how you approach it, a human being will take that perspective, and it does change your brain chemistry. It changes the way you think about things. And I think that's, one thing that's important here is that at the end of the day, there are human beings that go through this and at varying stages of their life with different impacts, different comorbidities, different personal life change situations that I think are very important to understand. And mostly a collaborative partnership with their doctor, with their primary and their nephrologist is super important. It's more important than most people know. And you just heard it from Samantha. And in some situations, I felt like I had that control, and some I didn't. It depended on the physician on the other end. Sometimes I had to take control, but not all people have the ability to have that kind of conversation with their partner. And I think it's important to have.
I think those are such important points. We're going to definitely go back to the diagnosis piece, and when we think about how we're handling the health equity questions that come with that, we want to make sure that we're thinking about the diagnosis piece. I also appreciate the emphasis on how we think about the clinician patient relationship, and I think that's something we all want from our own care teams for whatever conditions we're handling. And I want to acknowledge up front, because we're going to talk about this later. The ideal situation is every clinician has access to every option that's FDA approved for the patient in front of them. But we know we're far away from that ideal for a lot of reasons. And some of them are cost and price. And so we're going to talk about that and how we navigate that, because at the end of the day, it really shouldn't be on Sam and Tony to have to navigate the system to figure out how to fight with an insurance company to get access. And we have to acknowledge that sometimes access problems from an insurance company are a symptom of a problem because we can't absorb 20% premium increases anymore as a healthcare system. All right. I'm going to try not to get on my soapbox a lot today, but that was one. I might give myself three, so I've got two more. Shika and John, I wanted to turn to you about the steroid piece so we can just like have it out there. It came up a lot today. We acknowledge what the KDIGO guidelines say about this. We understand the benefit of Nefecon because it's acting sort of distally and should have lower side effects. But we also know they're being used. We heard from Samantha that they were being used. Is there anything that you'd like? I'm giving you kind of a platform here because we touched on it back and forth in the discussion today. But as we think about policy recommendations, and we think about the treatment approach for patients, John, I'm going to go to you first. I think you were pretty clear, but why don't you tell us again? Steroids not standard of care. Not trying, because this is going to help payers when they're trying to figure out their coverage policy for access to these new medicines. I'm just going to say it right up front. No step therapy through steroids? Doesn't make sense. John?
So from my perspective, no. I think
Okay.
you have to appreciate that I think everyone agrees the adverse effects of steroids, people would agree they exist. The
Yeah.
big controversy is over how much efficacy do we truly believe they have when we look at the published randomized controlled trial clinical data, which is very, shall we say, non-consistent. The testing study is almost exclusively in Chinese patients.
Right.
The Stop IgA study is exclusively in Europeans. We have no randomized controlled clinical trials of steroids in a US population or in the Hispanic population. The data is very mixed. And you will come across nephrologists who are very passionate that they believe steroids are the right choice. And you will come across people like me who believe, on reviewing the data, they are not the right choice because I'm not convinced of their efficacy and certainly not their long-term efficacy. And that's a real challenge for you guys to try and work out where on earth do these fit. Because whoever you talk to will have a slightly different opinion on this. And actually, if you go to certain countries, there will be a country persona on the use of steroids. You go to Italy, you only need to sneeze and you're going to be given steroids. Whereas you come to the UK or Northern Europe and you're not going to see steroids. So, and that's based on good doctors looking at the same data and interpreting it in different ways. So I think that's where we are, unfortunately. But that's the background that we live in. And that's why the steroid discussion has been so interesting.
Yeah. Well, John, and I appreciate that framing. Thank you, because you're right. Some of this is of an exercise in how well-meaning people with similar training can look at evidence and reach different conclusions. And so that's one of the things that we like to surface by having a multi-stakeholder round table so that we can hear those different perspectives. Because ultimately people will be making a decision about things like the utilization management, the step therapy protocol, et cetera, which we'll do a little more in detail. I'm going to go to Shika and then I'm going to go to Leslie because I bet she's itching to chime in a little bit on how some of the payers are thinking about these issues. But Shika, like what was there anything we've missed from this like very important and sometimes nuanced conversation about steroids?
Yeah, well, first of all, I also don't envy the decision because I think that we as nephrologists would also love to have more data. We would love to see comparisons that we don't have access to. And just thinking about, all of the totality of drugs we're talking about, the reality is, as we're able to prescribe them more, as they're available and there's increased access, we will actually get hopefully some of the answers that we don't have answers to today. But going back specifically to your point about steroids, I think the one thing that maybe didn't come across earlier is we're thinking about, we all use steroids short term in other diseases, and we're talking about trials that are, in the grand scheme of things, pretty short. But I just want people to stop for a second and think about, what does this mean many, many years down the road? And so I'll tell you, one of the other diseases that John and I treat commonly is lupus. And I can't tell you how many of these patients, because of long-term steroids, have avascular necrosis in their hips, and they are in excruciating pain. And so forget about treating their lupus. They are now living with debilitating pain from years or repeated exposures to steroids. Things that might not show up in a 2-year trial are things like osteoporosis, glaucoma. We're thinking about some of the shorter term side effects like infections, but we have to remember these patients are Samantha's age. And in addition to the, 80 pounds of weight she gained, and I'll tell you that a lot of our patients that gain weight from steroids can't get access to those new weight loss drugs because they're not diabetic. Okay. So not only did they endure all these side effects, but then they're left with the disfiguring and the steroid-induced diabetes and hypertension that may have come from it. And then now they have new chronic illnesses that they have to deal with. Had they never used steroids in the first place, they may not have had, right? So I just wanted to make sure that we were thinking about, what if that's what we were left with, what does that mean, not just in a short term for these patients, but what does this mean long term? Even if they got a short term dose of steroids, they're putting themselves at risk long term for cardiovascular risk and whatnot as well, in addition to the disease providing its own risk. So yeah, that's the only thing I'd want to add.
That's perfect. So Leslie, you talk to a lot of payers. We're going to spend some more time on things like coverage policy in a minute, but just on this question of where are there data, there's conflicting guidelines and recommendations. You heard from John. It might depend on what country you're in. Is there anything on this question that you'd want us to have in our heads as we think about what payers might be grappling with new medicine for a condition and a questionable standard of care? A varying standard of care. Anything you want to add, Leslie? And you're on mute. Yep. Leslie, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Thank you, guys. So, Sarah, thank you. It's very interesting, and the day has been extremely interesting. So, first of all, the payers are thinking exactly what everybody here has been thinking over the last X amount of hours. It's a really uncertainty, and they want to see, and I can tell you, we have heard this from many, they want to see the long-term data. They want to see durability. They want to see the eGFR, not just the proteinuria. They want to see head-to-head studies. I don't have to repeat everything that you went through, but they're absolutely telling us. And then, Sarah, and I think we'll get into it at a different time, but just as you said before, a health plan is a steward of everybody's money. And so when these prices, when these are, and I'm going to give you the WAC, which I know that you looked at yours, you actually went on a rebate, a net as opposed to our gross. So, but for the WAC at anywhere from 170,000 a year to 520,000 per year, so over $500,000. That's an extremely expensive product or products for health plans, and they really want to make sure that they're being used in the right way. So that's one more thing to add, and I don't know if you had any more questions about this, but these drugs, the ones that are already marketed, have already gone up 6 to 30%. So a variety. One went up 6%, one went up 7%, one went up 24%, and one went up 30%. So they've already increased costs. Not sure why. I'm going to
Okay.
stop there because I think we'll get to others about step
We'll get
therapy
to that.
prior
We're definitely,
authorization. Yeah.
yes, we're going to do that, and we're going to get back to price and price increases. Jay, I'm excited you have your hand up. I was going to go to you and Lobot next on this question, but
Not
I mean, I have a prediction of the answer to the question, do you think there should be step therapy for these new medicines? But I'm going to let you address what you've been hearing your colleagues say about the nuances here, like needing more, wanting more data. Please chime in, Jay.
Yeah, well, I was going to go back to the steroid piece. I just want to add
Please.
another piece that I don't think has been touched on, at least I didn't hear it, is we've looked at the real world evidence data and we've seen post biopsy a patient getting IgAN in the claims data at least about 60% get a fill for a steroid. But then
Okay.
they only get, but the majority of them get one, and then they don't go
Right.
to anything else. So I do have a concern that they will receive a steroid, drop off, and then they start losing kidney function over
Sure.
time because
Okay.
of loss to follow-up. And not that they won't follow up eventually, but that gap in care is a real concern that I think we should be considering at the same time with respect to steroids.
I appreciate that point, and we'll note that as we think about the whole journey. Before I go to you, John Lobout, I'm going to give you the chance, whether on the steroid piece or just a little bit of what we touched on about the challenges with data, with not understanding the standard of care. How are you guys thinking about that in terms of having an approved product for this condition?
Right. So thank you. This has been a great presentation altogether throughout the day. So I wanted to just add how much I really learned and enjoyed hearing from Sam and Tony. It really put a big perspective on what do really patients want, which is ultimately what do like manufacturers want, right? We want our drugs to make sure that they work. And I'm so sorry, Sam, to hear all the side effects that you've had on Nefecon. But it is, unfortunately, Nefecon is being grouped in, I mean, it is in steroids, right? Systemic steroids, but it is not your typical steroids. And I was so happy to hear, Shika, you were talking about steroids not being a standard of care, and there should be no comparison there. So that is what I really enjoyed in hearing. One other thing that Shika, you mentioned about your patient who was doing well on Nefecon but got rejected to continue treatment on Nefecon because it was doing well. That's another thing that I wanted to just bring up. I know that our label is just for 9 months and then 15 months off, but this is where, it's always been talking about having real world data on long-term effect of drugs, not just Nefecon and everything else. But when there is no approval from the payer side, how do we actually collect that long-term data that is so needed desperately? So we want to see how we can work really together with all different stakeholders, because ultimately we want to make sure patients have access to the drugs that they need, that not only that access, but also affordable for them as well. So that's my 2 cents.
Well, I appreciate that. This comes up in a lot of the reviews that we do about
Mhm.
how do we commit to developing additional evidence after an approval. It's going to be really
Right.
hard to recruit somebody into a clinical trial. If there's an approved drug, why would they go into a clinical trial? Real world evidence generation to be done well is hard, like, to say the least, right? Like you got to be very careful about how you're scoping your questions and looking at the data and doing matching and all of those things. And so I think that's fair. I do think it's also fair, though, that when and Leslie, I appreciate how you said this. When we acknowledge that health plans and purchasers and our employers, that for most of us are paying for our health care,
Right.
are stewards of other people's money, sometimes relying on the label is what they do to make sure that
Exactly.
they're being good stewards. So we'll examine that tension as we talk a little bit more. John, you've been very patient. Please chime in.
Yeah, no, I was just reflecting on what Leslie said, and I think we do have a real challenge here that everyone would love to see head-to-head data. We would
Right.
love to know a sequence of drugs that would make life really easy. The challenge is that I just honestly don't think we're going to get that. I don't
Yeah.
think sponsors are going to do head-to-head trials once their drug's approved. I don't think sponsors are necessarily going to do combination trials because we haven't even talked about adding two of these very expensive drugs together yet. And there are other classes of drugs that Leslie alluded to that we're not discussing today. And what I think that will mean is that international guidelines that are evidence-based will have a number of different choices at the same level that you can choose as first and second line therapy. They're not going to say use drug A first, and if drug A fails, use drug B, because there will be no evidence, because there will be no head-to-head comparison. And what you're going to ultimately end up with is an evidence base that puts everyone on the same playing field and says we just can't honestly compare because there isn't any robust data. Or you will have opinion pieces that say, in my personal view, this is how we should do it. And which is right? How are we going to use this? How are the payers going to think? Well, which, one person's coming up with drug A first, another person wants drug B first. Are we just going to say yes to everything? And I really struggle to see how we're going to move this forward when we're not going to have the right trials to generate an evidence base. And I think we have to realize that's the world we're going to be living in for the next few years.
Yeah, I think you're right. And we've seen this in other classes of drugs that we've looked at, or just sort of our observations about what happens out in the real world. But we're still going to take some optimism into our time together for the next hour, because I think that there's also an opportunity to say, well, what if we could do it differently? And what would that look like? And I'm not going to make Lobat answer this, but like there's a scenario where sure, you can have a second course of Nefecon if you agree to be enrolled in just an observational study about it, and Veloxis pays for it. Right. So like there are options there that allow us to gather the data that make it easier for. Sorry. Okay. I wasn't going to make you answer, Lobot, but you came off. You
No,
came off
but
mute.
you
So.
know, it really is. We hear that some people do so well on Nefecon and they just want to stay on it. And some insurance companies approve it and the patients stay on because they are doing really well. And some insurance companies don't. So there is real world data out there, even though it's off label, but it exists. And we need to, as to like what John was saying, there's not going to be a head-to-head clinical trial. So we have to make the most out of the real world data that's already out there and just look at the long-term outcomes for not just Nefecon, all the other ones as well.
But Lobat, Calliditas Veloxis is doing exactly that.
Yes.
They're doing the Nefextend study where you are providing exactly
for a
multiple
course.
Yeah.
For a long term.
No. A+ for I knew that. I think we mentioned that in our paper, and I'm glad that we surfaced it here because we did actually mention that as well. Okay, that I love that both of the clinical experts wanted to chime in to make sure.
I just want to give them the credit that they're doing the study that we need. We need that data. So they
further repeated. Yes. Right.
So I just wanted to clarify. Yeah, it is the OLE data that we're collecting, but also in addition to that, it's the outside of that, like real world data that patients are now part of the OLE and are still doing that. So that would be in addition to that. Yep.
Thank you. All right. Sorry, John, another point. Please go ahead.
Sorry, all I want to do is commend the companies. I didn't want what I said to be negative. We are in this position. No. In my career, I never thought we'd be having these conversations because no one had ever been interested in IgA. And we've now got wonderful treatments. But also, like Calliditas doing Nefextend, we have a lot of these companies are doing additional trials to look at, for instance, can we choose the right patient for this drug? Doing repeat kidney biopsy studies, doing biomarker. So this is a work in progress. So there will be movement here. And many of the sponsors on the call are doing studies that will help us ultimately get to the point of understanding which drug for which patient. But we're not quite there yet.
You guys are taking my call of like having positive energy very positively. I like that. Leslie, keep the positivity going.
One more thing I want to add, because we're talking a lot about like head to head, which we know really may never exist. But the other piece, and I know you said it a few times, there are different people today, the durability of it. Because if a health plan is going to pay for it $500,000 per year on some of the drugs, They want to know that the drug will last and how long it would last for, the effects of it. One thing I do have to say about side effects, and I understand and remember that if people here are uncertain on this panel are uncertain about the side effects, you can imagine what the health insurers are actually saying the same thing. They're very uncertain. One thing about the side effects, and we see this all the time in rare diseases with sickle cell and all the rare disease and DMD, et cetera, is that you really don't begin to see some of these side effects for other products until after it's been on the market for a while and more people have gotten it. We all know that. So these, Sarah, are just some of the other things that a health plan has to pay attention to too, because remember, they are taking care of that patient once that patient does have those side effects
But that to
with it.
me, yeah, listen, to me, that's also a part of why this has to be seen as a continued partnership, because
Absolutely.
it is oftentimes only in the payer data when we start to see some of the rarer side effects that you wouldn't see in a 2-year trial, and we need to make sure. I think that the statistic is something like about 30% of biologics end up with a black box warning after they've been on the market. And so
Absolutely.
that means it's after they're being used, and we understand biologics are serious medicines, and we want to make sure that we know as much as we can about the appropriate patient and the safety and efficacy. You guys are great. I haven't actually gotten to like question two because you have so much. This is wonderful, though. You're making my job so easy, John, and then Sam.
So, just from a UK perspective, NICE approved drugs for the NHS and agreed that the NHS will pay for them. And as
Yes.
part of that process, for one of the new IgA drugs, they have stipulated that if we haven't seen a response at a defined time point, the drug is stopped. And I
Yes.
don't know, and I'm not saying this is right or wrong, but I'm not sure whether payers in the US could stipulate so that actually that means you're
Yes.
not spending money on drugs that aren't
That aren't
aren't
working.
working,
That's right. Yeah.
and that way you can concentrate drugs to the right people.
Yes.
Now, of course, there are lots of nuances to this, but I'm just interested. We've seen that for the second drug that NICE have
Yeah.
approved for IgA very clearly in their
Yeah.
guidance to us.
Yeah,
Jonathan,
Leslie,
sorry.
why don't you educate everybody about the stopping rules that sometimes
Yeah.
happen, especially with new therapies?
So there's a Jonathan, that's wonderful. And we've been looking at NICE for years. So I go way back with ICER and I go way back to her predecessor, he did his internship right at NICE. However, on the insurer side, that's exactly what does happen. Usually we look at the inclusion and exclusion of a study. We may use that uh, as the beginning to who should get it. And then in this case, it probably would be a 9 month to 12-month approval on some of the medications because that's what the studies were, and everybody from the manufacturers can talk about that. But sometimes, Jonathan, if they began to see if a maximum effect of a different drug is within 12 weeks, that first approval will be for 12 weeks. And then you see it, you begin to, there's continuity, yes, it's working, not causing side effects. Yes, yes, yes. So that actually it very much does occur. The other thing they do in the United States, I don't know if they do this also in the UK, but you give a limited supply at one time. So you give a month to begin with. You may give 2 weeks to begin with, because I cannot tell you how much medication is wasted because the patient takes 2 weeks of it and cannot tolerate it on.
Right.
In this
Right.
case, in a once monthly injectable, it would be a 1 month, obviously. So
Right.
there are things like that will stop it so you do not have a lot of
Economy in your
waste.
midst. Yep, that's great. Sam, thanks for your patience. Please chime in.
Oh yeah, I was just gonna speak from the patient perspective of
Please.
how, like you were saying, it takes a long time for these side effects to come out. I went on Nefecon in April of 2023. So this was right after it was like came to market. And at the time, the evidence for there being limited side effects, well, it was there, and it obviously was there enough for me to decide to go on it, or to be convinced to go on it despite it being another form of steroid. Knowing what I know now, would I do that? Maybe not. But at the time, like, and if I was put in that same position, knowing what I knew then, I would probably do it again. Um, And then, well, Bob, thanks for apologizing. No one could have knew that I would have, been one of those patients. So, but I did respond very, very well to the drug in terms of like my IgA progression, and where I'm at now from when I was diagnosed is, it's like I'm a
Great.
completely different case. So.
That's great. Sam, for me, what I hear from the stories you, Antonio, both have been sharing today is I often talk about this as the need to de-escalate the arms race, right? So a lot of restrictions that are in place that frustrate Shika and John, that frustrate Leslie's clients because they're implementing them, whether it's prior authorization or other sort of utilization management, is that it's a symptom of a problem that goes back to how much money are we spending in our healthcare system and how are we thinking about affordability and sustainability. And so I appreciate, and we continue, and we'll make sure this is reflected in the policy recommendations. The patients are not the ones to punish for the fact that the rest of the system has had trouble getting their stuff together, right? So whether that's the cost sharing, the deductibles, having to try something that you've tried before and it didn't work, that's my favorite that doesn't make any sense at all. You're not going to magically likely respond to something you've tried before that didn't work. And so we'll also make sure that that's reflected, that that's not really how the system is supposed to work, that it's supposed to be on you to carry the burden of the fact that higher and higher prices, sometimes out of line with value, are being met with more and more access restrictions as a way to control the affordability of the healthcare system. Again, this is not how we would do this if we could start from scratch, right? I think we can all acknowledge that. Anyway, okay. That's my second soapbox. I told you I was going to get 3, but one of the benefits of being moderator is I may give myself more because that was number 2. I would like to go back to health equity, which is where we usually start, but that was such a robust and important conversation, and mentioning the steroids, getting a taste of what we're thinking about on the coverage policy piece. One of the things we like to do is make sure that we've acknowledged if there's any concerns about new therapies exacerbating health equities, potentially helping address them. For me, and learning about this disease, reading our report, hearing from the patients, a few things that have come up for me and that I wanted to hear reflections on, especially from Samantha and Tony. Problems with diagnosis, how long it takes, whether or not there are some gendered things that might be happening there, where we just assume every woman who comes in with protein in her urine or blood in her urine has a UTI. I want to talk about that and what we're doing to make sure that we're addressing the problems with diagnosis. Managing and addressing fertility needs of patients in a patient-centered way is now going to be one of the things that we put into our policy recommendations. Access to specialized providers. I already heard from John earlier today that not every nephrologist is probably the one you should be talking to if you have IgAN because it's so specialized. That can exacerbate disparities if all of the specialists are at academic medical centers and it's hard to get in to see them. And then we touched a little bit on cost sharing. So let me open the floor for people who've been thinking about how their role in addressing health disparities, their role in helping their patients navigate them. What are you seeing either from that menu or others that are really important for us to highlight in our recommendations? John, go ahead.
So the nephrology community has understood that actually management of glomerular disease is getting more complex with all the new wonderful drugs we have. So the International Society of Glomerular Disease has put together centers of excellence and a proposal for identifying what constitutes a glomerular disease center with the expertise to look after patients. And GlomCon, which is a parallel organization, has done something very similar. And the great news is they're now working together. So we're going to have a unified approach to what constitutes a glomerular disease center of excellence, which will then look at referral pathways, diagnosis, access to treatment, not just drugs, but access to psychosocial support, integration in clinical trials. So that is actively ongoing. There are going to be publications coming out shortly. So I think from that perspective, I think you can be confident that the nephrology community is getting its house in order.
That's great. And John, is telehealth a part of that, like allowing for there to be consultation and access to some of these centers of excellence, not necessarily in person?
So that's really interesting because in the UK, I do all my clinics on the telephone because my patients are young and the last thing they want to do is go to hospital. And I'll defer to Shika here. But when I talk to nephrologists in the US, they'd love to do that. But the billing system and the way the kind of process of how you manage that appointment and get reimbursement doesn't facilitate that approach. But I'm going to stop there because I clearly I'm not an expert, and I'll pass over to Shika.
Yeah, Shika, please.
Yeah, so I would love to do more telehealth. So speaking to that, I recently moved to Texas from Chicago. I have a whole group of IgAN patients in Chicago that, want to continue their care. I think one of the challenges in the US is you need to be licensed in each state, and
Wow.
various states have, very, very strict guidelines in terms of even if my own patient is in tech right now, like lives in Texas, but goes to California on vacation, they're supposed to be in Texas when even if they're having a telehealth appointment. So I think there's them challenges around that, which I think are, as you mentioned, like barriers to us helping our patients. I think the other thing that I wanted to bring up is the fact that it's been brought up, diagnosis is delayed. And just to compare the United States to another country, for example, in Japan, correct me if I'm wrong here, John, but I believe every child has a urinalysis before the age of like 8 or so. And so you can imagine here in the United States, one of the things that we're really working on is just raising awareness about the importance of UA. If you saw the Super Bowl, there was a Super Bowl commercial about getting your UACR checked, which kudos to the National Kidney Foundation. But I think that one of the biggest challenges right now is that we're not even checking urine in our patients. We're not, and you heard this from Tony, and I think Samantha, this is a disease that is not going to come to attention unless you have an abnormal blood test. By that point, it's probably too late already. Or you have a urine test. Another thing I want to point out, this was mentioned at the very beginning, I think the first talk, is, people present differently. You're not always going to have blood in your urine, and a very small number of patients are going to see blood. The minority of patients are going to see blood and come to attention earlier. So you just can imagine how many people were probably missing. Or like you said, Sarah, beautifully, a lot of women are told it's just a UTI, and a lot of men are like, oh, you must have a kidney stone, so let me go send you for a CT scan. Talk about a waste of resources and costs, right? So I think there's a lot of work that we need to do to be able to get these diagnoses earlier. And then just to circle back to what was brought up with payers, they want to pay for drugs based on the label, based on the trial, right? And I understand that because that's the evidence we have. But I think we have to step back and also realize if we could identify these patients earlier in their disease course and treat them earlier, we could prevent a lot of those downstream effects. We could, and I think a lot of the companies are now looking into, phase 4 trials or phase 2B trials where they're including patients who were at lower levels of proteinuria or lower GFR levels to look at safety and efficacy to be able to add to the data that we already have. And hopefully that's going to allow payers more comfort in, allowing us to get to our patients sooner, because ultimately that's what we want. We don't want them to have to go through all these different hoops and lose all this GFR before they can get their hands on something that we are pretty sure is going to work for them.
That's very helpful. Labat, go ahead.
Shika just took the words right out of my mouth. It's really exactly what you said. I think we see early diagnosis really as the key, because by the time you're diagnosed, you're already 50% of your nephrons, right? And we see that as an opportunity to educate, really, not only physicians, but also patients as well. I mean, the 2 patients that we have on the panel here are very educated already, but not everybody is. So everybody, and we are doing our share of educating, your common nephrologist is like, when you see that early UTI is really not UTI, how do you actually take it the next step? Be a lot more aggressive in diagnosing earlier on, so you wouldn't see, both from the payer point of view, the long-term cost is, hopefully you avoid that. As the earlier diagnosis, you could treat earlier and all of that. So I just wanted to add to what Shika said about that.
Thank you. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, just on this note, the IgA Nephropathy Foundation is actually funding a trial that's been run by Sena Narutsi out of California, where she's proactively going and screening patients with urine dipstick testing at various events to try and identify the value of urine dipstick screening to identify disease earlier. And as part of that work, we're doing a systematic review and meta-analysis of all the published data for population level screening of blood and protein in the urine to identify rare glomerular disease. So I think the IgA nephropathy community has really taken this issue of late diagnosis to heart and is going out to think about how they can improve matters.
Well, I'm excited that we can highlight a lot of that work that's going on in the health equity section as we think about diagnosis. We can think about the ways that a system that's paying for value can de-escalate some of the cost sharing concerns that I know we heard from patients when we were doing the scoping for this review. And that happens in many of the reviews we do. It's not specific just to this condition. So it's a feature, not a bug of our system that we can continue to address. Sam and Tony, let me go to you about, and I know you're both working as volunteer ambassadors for the patient community, not necessarily from your own experience, but from talking to other patients, anything that you've identified that we can be doing from an equity perspective, whether it's the diagnosis, the cost sharing. Tony, go ahead.
Yeah, one, I'll speak in experience, not fact, right, as a patient and an observer. And, part of this is, the fact side of it, the data that shows, that a higher percentage of Asian descent or Hispanic descent, right? And I have both. And so I fall into that qualification, but, that the underserved communities, either Hispanic, Black, whatever, white, whatever angle you want to look at for those communities that need access to healthcare. Part of the challenge is they don't get tested. They don't go to doctors often. They don't think about getting urine dipstick, checked out. It's just not a normal thing. Hopefully that's changing, but it's still abnormally low comparative to the average, potential patient out there. So I do think that there's ways for us to communicate differently, get into communities and give access in a different way, like urine checking that is much easier to get at versus blood testing or getting somebody in to see a doctor, which, they have a lot of nervousness about that. I think it's really important to think about how we get into communities in different ways, because I believe there's a huge population that is underserved and not checked. And the earlier we can check, the more, one, we get more access for them, but also we get more data, I think, which is important as well. The other thing I want to add a thought on was, combining medications. I go back to COVID when monoclonal antibodies was something that was pushed through very quickly. And being a transplant patient myself, November of 2021, that was a pretty scary time. You get a new transplant, your immune system's fully, suppressed. You don't know what to do, where to go. You're wearing, all these things to try and keep yourself safe in the environments that you're in. And something came through quickly that had shown some quick proven results combining two medications together. And I'm not even thinking about cost. I'm thinking about how to prevent my kidney from being hurt, right? So if I contracted COVID, which unfortunately I did at one point, 2 years in, which was better. But there was that thought. I didn't think, oh man, I have to go talk to these manufacturers. I have to go talk to the doctor about pulling these two things together. What's the cost against this? Those are things that would have caused a lot of concern to trying to make that happen. And I think a lot of people do go through that scenario that we have to think about.
Thank you, Tony. Tony, is that fair to put some of that on the organized patient groups? And I'm assuming they're doing a fair amount of this already, sort of educating about what the disease is, how to get diagnosed, how to advocate for yourself in a clinical setting. So is that a fair thing to continue to want from the patient advocacy community?
Yeah, I don't think it's or, I think it's and, right? I think it's that in partnership with, healthcare, in partnership with, providers, in partnership with manufacturers. I think anywhere we can get that access, I think will help.
Thank you. And Sam, how are you thinking about some of the equity issues from your community that you talked to?
Um, well, you already kind of touched on the the delay in diagnosis
Yeah.
from being a female and them saying that, oh, it's just a UTI. I actually experienced this.
Okay.
And it went on for about a year and a half until I finally reached a diagnosis or found a doctor that cared enough to take a special interest in me. And this
Mm.
isn't something that is unheard of. Like you said, there's a lot of other patients, female patients that have reported this. When really they should just, once you have that UTI, maybe they just take it for a little extra testing, see what's going on. Or if they're reoccurring, every 2 weeks, you're having bouts of cold-colored urine, just, take it a step further.
Yeah.
I'll go like to echo what Tony said, there's a lot of people when those like with the intersectionality of different marginalizations that don't have it. Like I'm of Japanese descent, and so of course there's a higher disposition for me to have that there. But I grew up in Las Vegas and in a community where myself and a lot of my friends and people that I grew up with didn't have access to healthcare at all. So when
Mm.
there was something that, if you were kind of sick, you just stayed home, drank some Sprite, or if it was really bad, you'd go to the urgent care. Like most of my friends and myself, growing up, we didn't have like a normal healthcare provider. It wasn't until I got married that I had that.
Mm.
I know that there's other organizations that are going out there and doing like some sort of testing on wheels in these communities that might not have
Hmm.
access regularly. And if they could expand that to other communities, somehow that would be great. I'm not sure the logistics of that or the feasibility, but I'm certain that if I had that earlier, I would have had a much easier diagnosis process and wouldn't have gone on chemotherapy a week after I was diagnosed.
Mm. Sam, thank you for that. One of the things that's coming through in this conversation, which has come up in previous ICER reviews, because we often are looking at a drug or drugs that are the first thing to work for a condition. And you think back to something like spinal muscular atrophy, when the first therapies were approved, we weren't screening for spinal muscular atrophy through genetic screening for newborns because we didn't have anything to offer them. Right. And so then when there was something, now it's part of I think it's part of the newborn screening panel in every state. And so there's a parallel here for I would understand why a healthcare system wasn't interested in paying for a UA for every 8-year-old until we knew there were actual treatments for the potential diagnosis. And so, I mean, there's tension there. I totally get the value of knowing is real for patients, but as we think about how systems think about resources. So I think I feel a shift, and with the pipeline, with the approved therapies, we can be thinking more about how the diagnostic journey can be improved. John, thanks for your patience. Go ahead.
Yeah, just in terms of equity, we've looked in radar, the UK population, and we've been able to show very clearly that those patients with a with a higher deprivation score um, lose kidney function faster with IgA nephropathy compared to those with less deprivation. So there is data out there, and I think that's common across most forms of kidney disease. But you then compound that by those with the greatest deprivation having the least access to healthcare and these wonderful new treatments, you're going to actually amplify that disparity. So, I mean, that's UK data, but we do know that if you have more deprivation, your rate of loss of kidney function with the same disease will be worse.
Okay, thank you. We'll make note of that as well. All right, two other topic areas I want to hit in the last half hour, but also this is your first warning that your final ask for today when we're together is you get to ask someone in the system to do something differently. It can be a call to action sort of generally, but the more specific, the better. There's no pointing allowed though, but you are allowed to say, I wish the system would change to do X. I wish there were prices aligned with value. I wish that I didn't have to fight with insurance companies about renewing therapy. But that is a final call to action that you all get. So now you get a half hour to think about that. But next, we're going to talk a little bit more about coverage policy. And instead of putting Leslie completely on the spot for this, I'm actually going to start with Lobat and Jay. And I understand you're here representing your companies that are making therapies for this condition, but you're also like, you've gotten healthcare in this country. You understand how health insurance works, and you know, like, what the trade-offs are for trying to ensure affordable access. How are you guys, let's start with you, Lobat. How are you thinking about the place in therapy? What types of coverage policies do you think make sense? I'm going to push you to say more than it should be approved for every patient and every clinician who wants it. But like, what do you think? Clinical trial criteria, like the 9 months only? Like, give us a sense of how you're thinking about what the evidence shows for what a coverage policy could look like that's reflective of the evidence around Nefecon.
So, I'm gonna rely on KDIGO guidelines really
Okay.
for
Okay.
I think our label, what the indications are, what the population inclusion exclusion criteria is, and now with the 2025 KDIGO guidelines, that is really where we stand as a
Okay.
company. That's what we follow. That's what we recommend. And we know there will be updated versions of KDIGO guidelines coming, but that's where our stance is right
Okay.
now. We understand that there is a prior authorization.
Yeah.
There's no question about that. I mean, we understand it. This is a new drug. This is more expensive. There is going to be prior authorization.
Okay.
We completely understand that. But we also want to see how we can work with payers and physicians to make this easier. What can we do as a manufacturer to make it easier for patients to have affordable access and actually have access from there?
Great. No,
That's
I appreciate that. Jay, before I go to you, Leslie, just on the sort of the reliance on guidelines, we've heard that from a lot of payers over the years, that that's an incredibly important source for thinking about coverage policy. Does that jive in this case too?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It happens with oncology. Everybody knows NCCN.
Yeah.
There has to be a base for something.
Good.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you, Leslie. So Jay, how are you thinking about this? I know that your PDUFA is still a couple of months away, and I know that IgAN community is rooting for another approval in this space. But you're going to be entering a market. There's already some other therapies. How are you guys thinking about your payer engagement? What you think an evidence-based coverage policy looks like? How are you guys thinking about those issues?
Yeah, I would also align to what Labat said in terms of guideline directed care, with a caveat that the KDIGO guidelines are a little bit outdated. So it's
Okay.
taking them a little bit of time to catch up. But
Yep.
the directed therapy of what it's suggesting in the guidelines, we truly believe in. Where I say it's a little bit behind is in terms of evaluating specific therapies. So it needs to catch up. We believe it will, and we have confidence that it will. Um, we, you know, we feel strongly it's a B cell directed condition, and a therapy to treat that and target that as the foundational care is what we believe in. And that was a change that I would say the guidelines made in terms of simultaneous therapy: treat the source, which is what we're talking about all today, and then treat the CKD. And we want to make sure that nephrologists have access to make the best choice as more data comes out. We've looked at data, and it's tough to be able to say, well, if they are below a certain proteinuria threshold, they don't meet a criteria. I struggle with that because we've seen in data, in real world data, that there's a third of patients after diagnosis, they fit that criteria, but 40% of them in 4 years are in stage kidney disease. And this falls in line with what John was saying earlier with the radar data. So we have to be careful putting cut marks or certain marks in place based on their kidney function right away, because there are fast progressors that may not show up right away. So we want to make sure that we allow the flexibility for the nephrologist to choose.
Leslie, am I right in assuming that's sometimes really hard to operationalize in a coverage policy? So, a coverage policy for a new medicine, especially one that's expensive, let's just sort of like name it, that's a thing. you rely on maybe the inclusion criteria from the clinical trial to say you have to meet like this protein level or this eGFR or whatever it is. How would you think about advising your clients to operationalize something like flexibility? Where is that possible and where is it harder with something like the cut points that Jay was talking about?
Um, you know, with so number one, because this is more rare, correct? There's not that many people with it. And because so it does get more attention. So the reason I'm saying that is because it becomes easier to be more flexible with it. Again, the base is going to be this was the exclusion, this was the inclusion. Maybe someone didn't have cardiomyopathy on it, and you have a patient and there's no data on it. I know both Sam, I think both of you had said that, that you had other things. Uh, However, it becomes easier. It is easier with with drugs like this to explain as long as the physician can go out and explain why they're thinking it, why they want it. I'm going to throw this out, and I know we're talking to you wouldn't be on the panel unless you were very good physicians, Jonathan, Shika, et cetera. But you'd be surprised as to what other physicians do. And it was interesting because I think one of the manufacturers said it's up to us to also help educate physicians. We were looking at some data at one point, and we realized that people with this particular disease were on combination therapy in some health plans that did not, um, there was, they were not really looking at the medications and what was happening to them. And that's very interesting because I don't think yet, as of and Jonathan and Shika, you can both probably talk to that combination therapy and what's going to happen in the future about it. So, it, that are the reasons. That is the reason, Sarah, that they look at health plans look at it to make sure it's being used for the right person, the right time. But there are definite, if there was a really good reason, it was going to be on a one by one, Sarah. It's not going to be on
Yeah.
yeah, it's
A
going to be
whole
a one by one
population
basis.
basis.
Yeah.
Well, a couple of things there, Leslie, that I think are just important again for like context setting. I think that so one of the other things we can say, the quiet part out loud, is that not every treating physician is as skilled as John and Chika, and that there are times that the coverage policy is a way to ensure that the care is evidence-based and it makes a lot of sense, or there's not two medicines being used at the same time that shouldn't. And that's something that there's a reason that there are policies for that. But the other piece of it is the flexibility that can also be built into the system so it doesn't become an administrative burden for everyone. And I think that's just sort of Jay's point, which is, listen, if there's reason to believe that this is going to be a fast progressor and they're not right at that cut point, if a physician can make that case to the payer, there should be an avenue for them to do so. It should be a quick turnaround, right? That's the other thing we hear a lot is like how long it takes sometimes. Now, my team knows that I don't like to talk about AI, but I'm throwing it out there that that's a way to potentially make things potentially go faster or maybe lower some of the administrative burdens here that happen with that flexibility that we'd want to see for this type of
Yeah.
condition.
Remember
Please.
one thing, and Jonathan, I know you have your hand raised, and I'm curious as to what you said. Want to say, however, do remember in the United States that both with all of our different businesses, so Medicare for the elderly, Medicaid for the poor, commercial, there are rules around prior authorizations or approvals, and those are done very quickly now. The health plans have to. And I have to tell you, after working for a health plan for 25 years, you don't fool around with patients when the doctor says we have a patient who has IgAN. You are not
Yeah.
fooling. You want to make that decision pretty darn quickly.
Yeah, good. Thank you, Leslie. John, go ahead.
Yeah, a couple of points. The first, going back to the guidelines, the FDA, I think, have been fantastic in terms of the full approvals that they've given, is that they haven't stipulated levels of proteinuria or GFR.
Okay.
They have
All right.
said if you as a nephrologist believe the patient is at risk of progressive loss of kidney function, then it is appropriate to use this drug.
Got it.
And if you look at the KDIGO guideline, we deliberately defined what risk of progression looks like. So you can say the label for the FDA says you can use this drug If the patient's at risk of progression, you can then refer to the KDIGO guideline that clearly defines what that risk of progression is in terms of proteinuria. So you have a process there. The other thing, just touching on Jay's point, which I'm very frustrated about in terms of KDIGO being behind the times, is specifically around these therapies. We have the National Kidney Foundation is putting together a workshop which will run in May, and Shikha and myself are involved in this, to specifically come up with some practical day-to-day guidelines on how to use these therapies in clinical practice, because there is nothing out there. And I think that's going to be really useful as well. So Sarah, just so you know, that there is a process. The nephrologists have understood everything that you guys have been talking about and said we need to do something about this. And so the NKF are supporting a meeting where a lot of nephrologists, mainly US nephrologists, are going to get together and come up with some practical advice from who's the right patient, what should we monitor, what's a success look like, can we actually safely combine them with other drugs, and we're going to produce a report that will be out pretty soon after that meeting in May.
Okay. John, I'll make a plug. I don't know much about that Thank you for bringing that up. That's the first time hearing about that process. I will say that my observation of how that sometimes goes, I'm going to paint a broad stroke. This is not aimed at anyone on this call. Often there's a condition that hasn't had a treatment in a long time, and now there is one. So the manufacturer sponsors a lot of efforts on education, whether it's for physicians, etc. Often lacking from the room, and patients are usually always like, are the payers and the purchasers. And I'm just kind of making a call to one of the things that we care deeply about at ICER is that we got all of you on the same call together to be able to have these conversations, even though you might be coming from different perspectives, because some of those discussions, the clinical, what's the pipeline, payers are often desperate to understand and get access to those experts to understand how to write the best clinical or coverage policy they can. And I think sometimes inviting the ultimate purchaser is an afterthought. And so I'm not saying that's happening in this case, but it's a little bit of a plug for if you bring everyone along and if you understand the different perspectives, we might be, again, able to de-escalate some of this a bit. Shikha, thanks for waiting.
Sarah, so I'm going to actually respond to that, and it related to what I was going to say. So, in addition to the NKF workshop that John talked about, the IgAN Alliance is doing an incredible job. And actually, at the first IgAN Alliance meeting, there were payers, and
Great.
I believe ICER was there actually, or someone.
Oh, that's right.
Yes,
I think we were.
yes, and I was so impressed by that. And
That's
I want
great.
to, shout out to some other organizations. ISGD and NephCure did a similar meeting for another glomerular disease, and also brought in an expert when it came to health economics. So I think we're getting there. And I will also just say one other thing. I was lucky enough to have John here in Houston a couple days ago. And one of the things we did together was we went through difficult IgAN cases, and I put John on the spot about how he would handle these particular cases, answering some of these questions that we're dealing with here. And there was a payer in the room at that NKF sponsored event who
Awesome.
actually spoke up. So I think, thank you to the payers who are willing to come, and to our organizations that are willing to invite them, because I think we're learning a lot here. If it's okay, I just want to quickly ask Leslie.
Let me say one quick thing, just because I would really like to make sure we highlight this in our policy recommendations, because that can be a best practice for how we're making these decisions, given that it's already happening. So I just want to make sure the team knows that that's something we want to highlight. Go ahead, Shikha.
Fantastic. I just wanted to ask Leslie, when you were talking about combination therapy, I wanted to make sure I understood, and I recognize that we as a community have a lot of education to do. Our nephrology colleagues, John and I, are lucky that we get to specialize a bit more on glomerular diseases. I got to give it to my colleagues. They're running around 3 different dialysis units, inpatient, outpatient. They simply don't have the time to keep up with the newest and greatest with one drug approval. Imagine getting them to know everything about 5 drug approvals in 4 years, right? So I think people like us are available, but we are doing those events, like I said, for the community to get the word out. But my question to you about the combination therapy, were you talking about combination immunomodulatory, not immunomodulatory? Because that's what the KDIGO guidelines is actually suggesting. Are you talking about 2 immunomodulatory drugs together? Okay.
No, it's your we when we actually looked at it, it was more of the it was definitely it would be more of a steroid along with an ERA. And that's what we actually saw a lot of. So I know we didn't talk at all about the ERAs, et cetera, in this. But right now, the combination that we're being asked about, or they're being asked about more, is the ERAs along with the steroids at this
Okay.
point.
Okay,
But
I
we
just
know
wanted
it's going to
to
happen, so don't get worried. But we also truly understand that there has to be your organization that goes out and educates. We understand not every nephrologist in the country can, under can study this at any one time. So
And no, and I think to your point, you're going to see more people prescribing combination therapy, but that is based on the guidelines. And actually, we're addressing two different things. As was mentioned by Jay, has been mentioned by John and others, we're talking about treating the immune drivers of IgA nephropathy and then the genetic.
downstream and upstream.
And the thing is,
Yes.
you can't have one without the other. So we have to remember, as we've talked about, you've already lost 50% of your nephrons by the time most patients are diagnosed. So we can't ignore the fact that we need to worry about like HIT4 and those distal processes and controlling proteinuria and thinking about cardiovascular risk and all of those other things that are going to prevent fibrosis and ultimately get us to kidney failure. At the same time, we have this opportunity to, for the first time ever, actually target the immune complexes and the immune drivers. And I think if you tell me the more people are prescribing two therapies, I think John and I are doing our job getting the word out because that means people are aware of what the guidelines are and they're not going with the one size fits all, either the ERA route or just the immune modulatory drug. So I hope that I hope you see more of that really, because I think that's where we need to go, where we
So
need to be comprehensively
yeah.
thinking about our patients.
So the last thing, because I know Sarah wants to get to other questions too, but the last thing about that, and that's the data that they need. That is the data that has to absolutely, especially if you have one product that's at 170,000 a year, another one's either 160 or 390,000 a year. So now you're getting up there again, well over that $500,000 per year. They want to know what they're getting from it. So they agree. I absolutely agree.
Absolutely agree with you. And I think we're encouraging more and more of those types of studies. We would
Good.
love for all of our industry partners to work together. I will just say in some of the newer phase 3 trials, for example, the sibeprenlimab trial, 50% of those patients were on SGLT2 inhibitors, I believe, as part of their background with a RAS inhibitor. So I think we are, and we have multiple other groups that are looking at combination with some of the drugs on either side. So hopefully we're going to have that data soon and be able to provide that.
So I want to shift to future research needs. I see your hand, Jonathan, but I am going to put Jay on the spot first. And I warned him this was going to happen, but I mean, his product is not approved yet. We have an approval of a drug with similar mechanism of action, and it's already got a price out there. Jay, talk to us about how you're thinking about price. You've heard from the community here. Payers are worried about how much we're spending on these drugs if we're getting both Nefecon and Sibi. What if you priced it to value? I bet Leslie would say, wow, payers would love that and might make the coverage policy look a little better. Can you share a little bit about how you guys are thinking about your place in the sort of the payment piece of this?
Yeah. Shika, I believe that was our trial that had the SGLT2 inhibitor, 50%. So we are seeing some combination therapy, just to mention that. But to your question, Sarah, I can't speculate on price because we're still several months out and I don't know what it is. What I can say is I do believe pricing decisions should be grounded on clinical value, durability of benefit, safety profile, long-term impact on patients in the healthcare system. And in this area, from my experience, pricing should be considered based on the magnitude durability of renal benefit. And it is a really, really big deal to stabilize kidney function. I don't know. I think it gets lost when we talk about all the numbers and the comparisons. But if somebody's losing 5 mils per year, they're going to get end-stage kidney disease really quick. And if you have a healthy kidney losing one, and you can get with these treatments back to one, that's a big deal. And as Shika just mentioned, that's not been available until recently, and that is a really big deal. And so we need to take that into consideration, or companies need to take that into consideration. Severity of disease, it's a young population, the impact on their lifetime. There's long-term costs associated with dialysis and transplant, which we've talked about before. And it really needs to align around the strength of evidence. And just one more thing I'll say is I do think it's important to recognize that therapies differ in mechanism, evidence maturity, monitoring requirements, and durability assumptions, and cross-product price comparisons without context can sometimes oversimplify distinctions. And I just want to state that at the same time.
Yep. I appreciate that, Jay. I mean, it's one of the reasons that we're very careful to do health benefit price benchmarks for the individual drugs, because the data on how the drugs work and what the side effect profile is different. And that's one of those reasons. I will give you this anecdote that you can take back to your team as you're thinking about your pricing strategy. Is when we looked at Dupixent for atopic dermatitis for its very first indication, hadn't been approved for anything. The company worked pretty closely with us to make sure that we had all of the data that we wanted and that they gave us feedback on how to develop the model. And then they picked a price in the ICER price range. And they didn't do that just because they thought it would be a good thing to do for society. They did it because it allowed them to put a lot of pressure on the health plans to say, and now you need to give access without a lot of utilization management and not a lot of cost sharing. And that's what happened. So there's opportunities for referencing an independent assessment of value that gets to this de-escalation and gets to the ultimate goal, which is affordable access for patients. So you could feel free to take that anecdote back to your team as you guys are thinking about pricing. Jonathan, I'm going to go to you, and then I'm going to give everyone an opportunity to tell me about some of the future research needs that they have. And then it's almost time for your final call to action. Go ahead, Jonathan.
So can I just ask, out of interest, do all of these processes for ICER and for the funders count the same for cancer drugs? Do you have the same ICER? Do you have the same? And
do we use
the
like the same thresholds and cost effectiveness? Do we take the same framework approach if we looked at a drug for oncology? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and the reason I say that is this is a real bugbear for us in the UK. Is cancer drugs are extortionately expensive.
Yes.
But not many people know this, and we have not done very well as nephrologists. The 5-year survival for anyone starting dialysis is worse than 7 of the top most common cancers. Yet when you have an argument about the pricing for a cancer drug, not saying it's right or wrong, you have a very different discussion to pricing for a kidney drug. And there's a 2-tier system here, and it certainly acts in the UK. And I just wonder how this is handled in the US, because we're talking here about cost of drugs. But in the grand scheme of a new treatment for myeloma that gives an extra 3 months of life, it's peanuts.
You are preaching to the choir. So we have similar challenges here. We at ICER use the same approach to thinking about the value of oncology drugs. I'll tell you, we don't do a lot of oncology reviews for 2 reasons. One is the standard of care changes so quickly. By the time we're done with an 8.5-month review, there might be 3 new drugs for a condition. It's just like the pace is so intense. Everyone relies on the National Comprehensive Cancer Network guidelines for looking at that. But that's also because there's been very little utilization management from the health plans on oncology. And so it creates a different dynamic for the pricing. I will say there's some data that's starting to come out that is showing that health plans are starting to change their approach to that. And I think it's because the cost issue has become so big, it's crowding out the spend that could be used for a new drug for IgA. And so we're starting to have that conversation. So you're not alone in sort of how the UK has had to deal with that and think about that. And I think there's a real benefit to companies. And again, I'm so excited that Jay and Lovat came to talk today by thinking about their role and their responsibility in that and trying to make it a little more fair across the conditions. Because I don't want to live in a society where it's like, well, my condition is worse than yours. And so then I get the expensive therapy and you don't get any. That's not how I view civilization. And so I think that and that's my third soapbox, and I will be done for all of my soapboxes today. We are almost at the time for final calls to action, but why don't we take 2 minutes for any future research needs that we didn't touch on? We hit on a lot of them, sort of durability of effect, combination therapies, the side effect profiles, repeat therapy with Nefecon, which we know is underway in that trial. Are there any other top tier research needs that you would like us to make sure that we mention? Jonathan.
Please, I would really want you to do this, is if we want to give precision medicine and target the right drugs and not waste money with the wrong drugs, make a plea that all the companies generate a confederated biorepository of all the blood and urine samples they've generated from their clinical trials.
Love it.
Allow access to academic researchers that will allow us to then identify biomarkers at the start of treatment or during treatment that help us understand which patient is going to do well on a treatment, which patient, a good biomarker to say, you've had the drug for 3 months, we've got a biomarker shows it's not working, let's stop that expensive drug, let's put you straight on the next one. We could do this. There are over 5,000 patients in clinical trials. So a plea for a confederated biorepository.
You got it.
Everyone puts some samples in, and we all agree with the focus is on identifying biomarkers to help patient care.
Perfect. Shika, go ahead.
Yeah, couldn't agree with that more. The more various sponsors can work together, the better it is for our patients, the better nephrologists can guide their patients. And on that vein, I think that if we can prioritize getting more data on combination therapies, that is going to help physicians be able to counsel their patients on what is and isn't safe and what is likely to work. And then I think the other thing that's sort of like the elephant in the room is this every patient asks us, do I need to be on this lifelong? What if I want to get pregnant, come off this therapy because none of these therapies can be used during pregnancy, or most of them, haven't been studied or just completely are contraindicated. Is that putting that patient at risk of having worsening kidney function during that pregnancy? And then what? Do they need to go back on it? What's going to be our indication? How are we going to know if you need to go back on it? And weighing sort of the risks and benefits on lifelong therapy. I think if we think about, carefully, and then, John, you and I talk about this sometimes as, if they're on a number of therapies, could we start by taking something else off and see how they do? What's actually going to hold them steady the longest? So I think that type of work would be very helpful because we don't want our patients having to be, on medications they don't necessarily need to be on forever. But right now, the data we have is you stop the drugs and everything comes right back. And that's what we have. And so we're going to tell them, I think you just got to continue this for now, right? First,
Let's add that. All right, Lovat, I'm going to you first for your call to action. What would you like to see from the system, from a particular actor, as it relates to more affordable access for patients? Go.
What I would say, I think one of the most important things that we have in mind is a pathway to earlier diagnosis. So if there's anything that we can do as a manufacturers, partnering with our physicians, partnering with John and Shika and patient advocacy. If there is any like one single study that we can pull together from everybody's perspective to really understand and identify how can we really do early diagnosis, because once we have that, everything starts from there. Your diagnosis and then treatment, sequencing and pattern, like all of that goes after that. But not until we fix that, I don't think anything else happens. Combination therapy, as you said, Chika, all of biomarkers, all of that stuff. It just, I think they all start from like that really early diagnosis. That would be my wish if we could.
That's perfect. That's a great wish. We'll put that there. Jay, what's your call to action?
I'm going to go the precision medicine. I think it achieves what you were talking about, Labat, and then also it also extends beyond IgAN into some of the other glomerular diseases as well. So I think it can help achieve multiple objectives at the same time.
That's great, Jay. Thank you. Leslie, your call to action.
Mine's a little less a call to action because everybody actually has the same thoughts, I think, here. But I would actually say to the manufacturers in your pricing your medications, think about what the prices are for two reasons that we are seeing, again, 7, 8, 9% increases per year on these new medications. Also, in the next 3 years, we could see 8 new medications, correct? If you look at the pipeline, over the next 3 years, we could have 8 more medications approved for these. And so there will be probably a competitive, and you will see health insurers making a preferred product. So just to
Okay,
be
thank
aware.
you, Leslie. That's great. Thank you. Shika, what's your call to action?
So agree with everything that's been said so far, but just thinking about the nephrologist who's in their office, especially the busy one that's running around the dialysis unit, I think making it transparent what information needs to be provided, how are drugs going to get approved and who's not going to get approved. So if there could be sort of less gatekeeping and more transparency to make this easier, because some of these physicians are just like, this is too much work with prior authorizations and having to get on the phone. I'll give you a quick example. This was a couple years ago, but I called to do a prior auth. No one was available to talk to me for a peer-to-peer. We'll call you back. And I said, here are some times that I'm not seeing patients. They, of course, called me back while I was seeing patients. And then they left me a message saying, we're closing your case because we've tried you 3 times. And I'm like, you've called me 3 times when I was seeing patient rooms. Do you want me to step, So I think if there could be a little bit more understanding on the side of the insurance companies, we are doing our best to get our patients access. They're counting on us. Please don't make this harder than it needs to be. And this has nothing to do with the pricing of the drug. This is just the workflow of it, because I don't want people not prescribing drugs that can help our patients because they just don't want to deal with the process.
I appreciate that. And I'm going to put a little asterisk on that. Sometimes it is related to the price of the drug because the price of the drug can contribute to some of the gatekeeping that happens, even if it's not evidence-based, and it makes everyone frustrated just as a way to control costs. It's just the reality of sort of what's happening. So a little asterisk on that. John, what's your call to action?
I think system changes to allow patients access to nephrologists with the expertise to look after them, and a system that doesn't mean that the referring nephrologist feels they're going to lose income by passing a patient to an expert. There needs to be a system change that says it's not good, any problem for me to get my patient, go and see Shuka to get an expert opinion, come back to me with a plan, and we can work as a team. And that's what patients want. And I think that will improve healthcare enormously.
That's great. So we're going to go to Tony and to Sam, but I can't miss the opportunity to give a special thanks to John for staying up late in the UK. I think I might have heard his Apple Watch tell him it was bedtime like 3 hours ago. And so I appreciate that you've been here, and you're the hardest working man in nephrology because you were with Chika in Houston like 4 days ago. So John, thank you for that. All right, Tony, what's your call to action?
Intentionality and follow through. I think those are two things that I would share, is that I think everybody here has the right intentions, and let's put that towards the right outcome.
Love that, Tony. Thank you. And Sam, final word.
Mine's similar to Shika's. I think that if my doctor prescribes me a medication, the insurance shouldn't be like, well, you should try this first. Similar to what she was sharing, my doctor's actually been running into the same thing. My nephrologist was prescribing me a medication. They keep telling me to retry something that I already tried. That didn't work the first time. But they have consistently called her during times she's been with other patients, and this has been going on for 4 months. So,
I am sorry for that.
oh no, you don't. It's not your problem.
No, but I feel that we even have our own criteria that we put forth for fair access for medicines that talk about how to design coverage policies that have an ethical basis. And one of the things we talk about is it is not ethical to require a patient to retry medicine that hasn't worked for them already. Like there's like that, we can do better than that, everybody. And so Sam, thank you.
The same example is trying to get intravenous and keep stabbing 3 or 4 times until you find the vein, right? It's like, no, get the right person to get in there.
You know, Tony, is one of the things that I have done as my friends bring me to doctor's appointments at times. I'm sure all of you have had this. Like once you like are in healthcare, you're the one that they call, and yeah, I'm like, no, no, go get the nurse on the floor who's the best stick. You've tried once and you missed. And so yes, that's an awesome call to action that has nothing to do with IgA nephropathy, but we'll allow it. My deep thanks to all of you for spending the day with us for this really enlightening and important conversation. I think that you heeded my call to action to try to maintain some optimism as we think about ways that we can ensure affordable access for patients and affordability for our healthcare system. And so thank you all for being here. And so it's my pleasure to turn things over to Lisa, who'll lead us through some final reflections from the CTAF. And so we can invite the CTAF to come back on camera. Thank you, everybody.
Wow. Thanks, everyone. I just want to also extend my thanks to the patient and clinical experts, all the roundtable discussants, and all the CTAF panel, and most importantly, as well, to all of ICER, who's made this a very well-organized meeting. It takes a lot of work to do the analysis, but also just put together a very efficient meeting. So now's our chance. We get to reflect. We have a little bit less time than usual, even before we were running late, but to share your reflections on the day. And I'm going to go in a kind of somewhat random order, but I'll start briefly. I'll say first, kudos to the pharmaceutical industry for really coming up with exciting new drugs in this area. Please, Vera Pharmaceuticals, think about pricing it at a fair price. Get rid of all those barriers to providers. You will become the dominant player in the market. All those local doctors will only know how to prescribe that. And so, take advantage, corner the market. And most importantly, by doing it that way, you'll provide a lot of patients who need this drug the access to it, which is really what we're all after. Okay. I think I used longer than I should have. Joy, I'm going to go to you next.
Okay, I have more or less an echo of what you said and reflecting on all that's been said today and really appreciating everyone who contributed and especially the patient representatives. Thank you. It's really, there are two issues. One is we need more data over a longer time period because we don't know what's going to happen in 5 years or 10 years of use for these medications. And until we do, it's speculative. And so I think pricing needs to take that into account. And also, it's just too expensive. Like, people will not be able to access your drugs at the prices that we've been talking about today. They need to be less expensive so that people can access them. And that's the biggest equity issue out there. And so I don't know how to fix that except to say that's what needs to happen.
Great. Thanks. Kavita? I'm going to move on to Anne.
Yeah, so I think I'm going to echo a lot of what has been said, but I'll keep it short. Basically, these therapies really represent very meaningful clinical advances. It's clear that they have the potential to extend life and improve quality of life for patients who have very serious disease. But their full potential can only be realized if they are priced responsibly. So I would urge manufacturers to align pricing with the demonstrated value so that we can ensure equitable, sustainable access for the patients who really need these treatments the most.
Thank you. Rita. While we're waiting for Rita Redberg, Tony.
Yeah, well, thanks everyone for a really informative and spirited meeting. My main takeaways from today were, firstly, the realization about how short the duration of the trials and have been to date and the lack of long-term data, which sort of contrasts with the 20-year duration or 20 years or more duration of this disease. Secondly, today there was a rather sudden mid-meeting controversy that broke out as to whether steroids should or should not be a comparator. It sort of rather complicated the voting, actually. But it was a good surprise to learn the horrible side effects of steroids are by no means obligatory. Last but not least, the exciting possibility that at least 2 of the new treatments will prove in due course, hopefully not too long in the future, to be a preventative treatment and break the progression to dialysis and ESKD. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Ralph.
Hi, I'll try not to be redundant. First, I want to congratulate you, Lisa, for doing a great job, particularly related to the voting. It was very complex. These drugs are clearly game changers for delaying the need of dialysis and renal transplantation. And I'm particularly hopeful that healthcare providers can put in mechanisms to identify patients with IgAN earlier in the course of their disease. I also want to emphasize the need for the utilization of large IgAN registries to collect real-world evidence assessing long-term benefits and potentially unappreciated long-term side effects. And I also want to acknowledge the industry's need to make sure these drugs are affordable for IgAN patients in our U.S. healthcare system.
Thank you. Felicia.
Through this whole meeting, I just kept thinking hope and promise, which of course are not the same thing. It's nice to hear of a drug with so much promise, and I hope, or maybe I wish, for more meaningful data, long-term and comparative, so we really fully understand that promise and can better answer the questions that ICER forces us to answer. And I also wish, same thing as others about the pricing. This is a relatively young patient population. There could be years of profit-making potential, and I hope that factor will play into the pricing.
Exactly. Great point. Sanket.
Thanks so much. First, really want to thank the patient representatives for sharing their lived experiences. I'm very hopeful with these new therapies that with longer term follow-up, we will see improvements in clinical outcomes, that the hope of the urinary protein to creatinine ratio will then materialize into eGFR improvements. It will materialize into ensuring that fewer patients are ultimately on dialysis and suffer the other adverse outcomes associated with advancing chronic kidney disease. And also hopeful that we won't see any negative side effects over the longer term. I'll just be reiterating what a lot of the panelists have said is I think that ultimately the price needs to be lower and more in order for more patients to be more likely to access it and hopefully derive these clinical outcome benefits. I really hope that we see the data. I hope that it will obviously take months and years to come, but I'm hoping for the best, but also with a lower price.
Thanks. Rena.
Well, I think it's been a fantastic meeting, so congratulations to everyone who's been part of it. Being in clinical practice in primary care for over 25 years and seeing patients with progressive kidney disease, whether it's from IgAN or other forms, on dialysis, needing transplant, I'm thrilled that there's another way that we can come at this with prevention. And I think more, seeing more real world patients like we did today would be extremely helpful. I do really want to echo what Bob had said earlier about not getting too lost in the weeds when it comes to systemic steroids. If systemic steroids were being tested or, developed today, they wouldn't make it past, a phase 2 trial because of the kinds of effects that they have. So it's unfortunate, I think, that we feel obligated to continue something that we would never, ever bring to market if it were today. That's it.
Great. Thanks. Jeffrey Hotch.
Thank you. I want to start by thanking the patients and manufacturers and clinicians. I think what you teach us is so very important. If I were to say any more, I think I'd just be repeating the other members of the panel. The thoughts and the themes are the same.
Jeff Klingman.
So I will bring in a perspective from one of my hats with organized medicine, and there's nothing that people loathe more than prior authorization. And I think if the price on this comes in, in these things is priced in a place that looks like it matches value, you can then potentially treat more people and make the process of approval easier. So the volume will go up. Even if the price is down, you'll end up with, a more profitable bottom line. And for some reason, people don't always think about that, but it is real. If it's easier for me to prescribe something because I have fewer hoops to jump through, guess which one's going to get prescribed? And so that is real. So I just want to point that out, keep that in your mind. And now I've pitted my pitch from organized medicine. Thanks.
Thanks. I see Rita's with us. Rita, do you want to go?
Sure, just to reflect. I mean,
Yeah.
I appreciate, as always, the work of the committee and the evidence. I just am sad that we can't make these decisions with better data, and I feel like there's a lot of industry influence on KDIGO, with industry funding and things that are not always, I think, in the best interest of getting good patient-related outcomes data. But I think our process was great. It was great hearing from everyone, and thank you.
Thanks. And then last but not least, Say.
Oh my goodness. So I absolutely want to reiterate thanking the patients, the experts, and the manufacturers for really engaging in this process. I think everybody obviously has different perspectives, and I am struck by the hope. I hope these are as good as they look now. And I am also thinking about all the other drugs that we have hoped would be great, and 30% of them have black box warnings after a certain number of years. And one of the things that I was thinking about was the fact that when I was an intern, one of my attendings talked about how he was around when steroids first became available. And they were the miracle drugs of the 1950s, of the early 1950s. And they were doing amazing things until we saw all the terrible things that they could do that we talked about now. And so I worry that given that we're talking about patient studies of 200, 500 people lasting only 9 months, 24 months, and these have to be used for potentially decades, I worry that I am hopeful. I hope these are as great as they look right now, and we need more data before I can be confident that the benefits of these drugs are actually substantially outweigh the benefits, outweigh the harms.
Thank you. And I misspoke. Bob gets the last word.
Well, thank goodness, because you always want to hear from me, don't you? Okay. I will on the policy roundtable because I think some sneaky things came out there that I'm not quite sure a number of people that said them understand the gravitas of, but I hope that there's some future there. I'd like to challenge the patient organizations involved in this area, the kidney cancer folks, to make a harder pivot now because of something that was pointed out in the policy roundtable. There's a bunch more of this stuff coming down the road right at us. The things that the patient groups need to be involved in much more now, to me, is fixing the systemic healthcare system issues that we've been bringing up over and over again, at least addressing them much more dramatically and directly. And my final thing would be there's a difference between CBER and CDER at FDA, and the comparison that's been unspoken all day and probably in the future about these things should not actually be the price of these drugs against dialysis. Those are two different branches of FDA. It's two different things going on, and the end result of these things is not the same, hopefully. So I think pricing structure, and again, back to patient advocacy organizations, get on these folks for the price now while you've got a real chance. Because the comparison should not be dialysis. It should be real life that we're dealing with. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Bob. Nice way to end it. Well, thank you, everyone, for a wonderful meeting.
Yes, I think we have just a final slide to throw up to let everybody know about the timeline for wrapping up. The posting of the recording will be up next week. The final report should be up around March 31st, and we'll talk about the votes in the policy roundtable today. And there's the link to find more information. Thank you, everyone, for being with us for the day. We really appreciate everyone's engagement and interest in this work, and I hope everyone has a really great rest of the week. Thank you.